Okay, thank you for joining us today. They say that only two things in this life are inevitable: death and, well, I guess we can just ask Paul Manafort and Rick Gates. Death can be tragic, it can be heartbreaking, it can be any number of things, but we can't deny that it is, in fact, inevitable, a natural part of this life. And yet, activists who agitate for physician assisted suicide would have us believe otherwise. A couple of years ago, comedian John Oliver was talking about the IRS. Apparently, if their phone system got overloaded, they would hang up on you. And they called this, if you can believe it, a courtesy disconnect. But as Oliver said, you can't just put a nice word in front of an unpleasant one and change the meaning, like assisted suicide. Aid in dying, death with dignity, whatever you call it, it's just an attempt to sugarcoat suicide. In 2014, 2,626,418 people died in the United States. 44,193 of those deaths were attributed by the CDC to intentional self-harm, suicide. That might be a little low, as we'll discuss later, but it's a tragic figure. We have public policies against suicide, and we've implemented laws, regulations, guidance, and resources that have helped to keep the suicide rate relatively low, if never low enough. Suicide is bad. States recognize these significant medical and non-medical costs and the physical, emotional, and psychological damage to patients' families and friends. But let's dig a little deeper into two of those deaths. On August 11th, 2014, actor Robin Williams took his own life. He was our genie, our captain, my captain, our good morning Vietnam. He was diagnosed with Parkinson's disease and Lewy body dementia. He was also in the midst of a long-term struggle with depression. He committed suicide, and we collectively mourned his untimely, tragic death, and also specifically his suicide. As studies have shown, losing someone to suicide has a definitive impact. Robin Williams' son has spoken out about the heartbreak he has experienced in losing his dad. The same year, in the same state of California, a young woman received a grim diagnosis of brain cancer. She too did not want to face living any longer, but she decided to enlist the help of a doctor. So she moved to Oregon, a state with legalized assisted suicide, got her drugs, and spent her last days campaigning for the legalization of assisted suicide. She died on November 1, less than 3 months after Robin Williams. Now, we might assume that the news media would take a similar approach to these two deaths, but we would be wrong. With Robin Williams, the language was visceral. Tied belt, slashed wrist, hanged, tortured, money worries, despair, failed, desperate, drugs, drink, depression, disease, demons, agony, sad clown, tragic, way too soon, it stings. The young woman, in contrast, choice, decision, her own terms, aid in dying. She left this world with zero regrets. She was inspirational, reigniting debate. And how did she die? The headlines demurely said that she took medicine. Both of these people were facing a terminal illness. While I'm sure neither wished for mortality or the dreadful diseases that afflicted them, both elected the time and place of their death within the circumstances they were in, and neither used an especially revolutionary tool to die. Ropes and poison both predate Socrates. But somehow, when you medicalize the procedure, when you get a doctor involved and stamp on the imprimatur of the medical profession, some people start to feel differently, even if the diagnosis is the same, even if the prognosis is the same. Our Irish colleague, Kevin Fitzpatrick, a paraplegic who eventually succumbed to the ravages of cancer, told an illustrative story. He said, when non-disabled people say they despair of their future, suicide prevention is the default service we must provide. Disabled people, by contrast, feel the seductive, easy arm of the few supposedly trusted medical professionals around their shoulder. Someone who says, well, you've done enough, no one could blame you. In America, it has been a long time since we even thought of prosecuting someone for committing or attempting suicide. Those laws are off the books, but most states do have laws against urging or helping someone else to commit suicide. To do so smacks of death culture, of potential coercion or abuse, even homicide. And many states passed those laws in the wake of the exposure of Dr. Jack Kevorkian, specifically to prevent people from being pressured by doctors into death. So in essence, what assisted suicide does is license professionals who are given the power to decide which lives are worth living, which people are eligible for death. Rather than protect patients or people generally, it protects one particular profession from prosecution for hurrying along death. So today we'll start to delve into the fatal flaws of assisted suicide, the law on assisted suicide, why the public and legislatures are pushing back and rejecting assisted suicide bills, a deep dive into one legalized assisted suicide model, and strategies to counter the push of assisted suicide activists. How does assisted suicide work? Generally, the laws have an application process to obtain the lethal dose, which includes a written request form requiring 2 witnesses, one of whom can be the patient's heir who would benefit from the death. Once that lethal dose is issued by the pharmacy, there's no supervision over its administration. There's no requirement for a witness of the death, someone who's disinterested. No one is required to be present at all. Where is assisted suicide legal? Here in the US, Washington, Oregon, the first in 1994, California, Colorado, Vermont, and DC, the first majority-minority jurisdiction to implement. Now, in 2009, the Montana Supreme Court allowed a possible consent defense to murder charges, but it has not been legalized. So even though the other side sometimes claims it, it hasn't really been legalized there. And in Morris v. King, there was a judge in New Mexico who legalized assisted suicide in only one county, despite, again, state law making it a felony to assist in a suicide. But we won before the New Mexico Supreme Court and did, in fact, reclaim New Mexico. But broadly, our Supreme Court has found that for over 700 years, the Anglo-American common law tradition has punished or otherwise disapproved of both suicide and prescribed suicide. The U.S. Constitution doesn't provide any kind of right to assisted suicide, and there's no federal law on the subject. There are 2 big Supreme Court cases on assisted suicide, and they continue to protect us. The Supreme Court gets it. They said that a ban on assisted suicide furthers compelling state interests, like the preservation of human life and protection from medical malpractice, coercion, financial pressure, and psychological complications. And they further said that if they declared assisted suicide a constitutionally protected right, that we would start down the path to voluntary and perhaps even involuntary euthanasia. And so, as we said, the vast majority of U.S. states do have a specific statute in place prohibiting assisting in someone's suicide. And this is even true in Oregon and Washington. They simply decided to make exceptions for assistance by one particular type of professional. But legislatively, assisted suicide is not an idea whose time has come. Assisted suicide bills have failed about 200 times in well over half the states, and from those 20 years of effort since Oregon, only a handful of states have been willing to risk it. Assisted suicide failed, for example, 5 times in California before it was pushed through. Even in Washington, prescribed suicide proponents had to try over and over before it passed. New Hampshire overwhelmingly rejected assisted suicide in 2014 with a vote of 219 to 66. And the courts have almost universally supported these prohibitions. In the last few years, we've won in courts in California, New Mexico, New York, and Tennessee. But that's not to say that assisted suicide proponents aren't still trying. When you look at this map, the red are the states where assisted suicide is currently legal. The yellow states are the states that have either introduced bills in this 2018 state legislative session. Some of them have already gone by the wayside, but these are the places that the bills have been introduced. And so you see that they're trying to really paint the map red as we have it colored. They're trying to get assisted suicide passed throughout the nation, and they're very strategically targeting states in their efforts to do so. Worldwide, just as here in the US, physician-assisted suicide and euthanasia have long been rejected, with just a few exceptions. The modern debate on assisted suicide began in the late 19th century. Switzerland being the first to legalize nearly 80 years ago. It's now the destination for so-called suicide tourism, is the only place that doesn't have a residency requirement. But the next major changes in the law came in the mid-1990s, when Australia briefly legalized assisted suicide in the Northern Territory and quickly became the first and only place to repeal it. Also in the mid-1990s, Colombia courts ruled that euthanasia on request was legal, but passed no law on the matter. Then through the 2000s, there was another big push. The Netherlands, Belgium, and Luxembourg all legalized euthanasia and or assisted suicide. And even though many of these nations try to draw a distinction there, in practice, when you have voluntary and involuntary euthanasia, and then voluntary and sometimes involuntary assisted suicide, you see that there is very, very little difference between those concepts. But when you look at this, it's still only 4 of 50 European countries. In the last couple of years, we've seen Canada in 2016. There's been a big push in Australia, and some nations are either coming in the next year or two, or they're less clear. And for example, the Australian state of Victoria, we expect assisted suicide to come next year based on what's going on in the law there. There was a lawsuit in New Zealand several years ago. We won that one. There was another lawsuit in South Africa, and that one, the High Court in Pretoria granted one terminally ill lawyer the right to assisted suicide, but fortunately that didn't apply to anyone else. There's been another court case in Germany. That is still a little bit up in the air. The court found a right to assisted suicide, but a former constitutional justice has begun pushing back, saying that in fact the government shouldn't be involved in deciding who is eligible for these assisted suicide drugs. We're watching South Korea very closely, expecting assisted suicide to come there. And so we're just seeing bit by bit assisted suicide proponents try to take over the map there. But we have also seen that assisted suicide has failed around the world. In Australia and France and New Zealand and Scotland, before the European Court of Human Rights, just to name a few. Worldwide, there is this objection to assisted suicide, very similar to that in the U.S. that the U.S. Supreme Court identified. And people around the world are pushing back. Why is that? Assisted suicide is bad public policy. Many polls have found concerns about pressure to die, the risk of inaccurate diagnoses, a reduction in end-of-life options, the expansion of prescribed suicide, sloppy procedures on the part of doctors. People are worried that the focus will be on saving money, not on saving lives, and legislators are listening. When you look at why people have committed assisted suicide, studies have shown that for most, it's not pain, it's not fear of pain. Bioethicist Ezekiel Emanuel summarizes that the reason is typically depression, hopelessness, and fear of loss of autonomy and control. In this light, he says, assisted suicide looks less like a good death in the face of unremitting pain and more like plain old suicide. In Oregon, one study specifically states that depression as a factor for requesting assisted suicide is overlooked. The National Alliance on Mental Illness states that depression affects one's thoughts, feelings, behavior, mood, and physical health. And yet, amidst this vulnerability, we are entrusting patients with the decision of whether or not they wish to die. And yet, the bills we've seen have no psychological screening requirement, only a circular requirement to refer for counseling if the attending physician believes the patient needs counseling. It doesn't happen often enough. Non-psychiatric physicians don't even believe themselves capable of adequately evaluating the need for counseling. In one study, 94% indicated that they could not determine whether a psychiatric disorder was impairing the judgment of a patient who requested assisted suicide. And even when doctors know a patient's judgment is impaired, they can't always save him. The patient can just doctor shop. This is actually happening. When a patient is suffering from depression, removal of lethal means is central to treating the patient. But the very point of assisted suicide is to hand over the gun. And decisions to commit assisted suicide may often be influenced by misdiagnosis. Around 15% of all diagnoses are incorrect, and more than 40% for disorders of consciousness. This rate has not changed despite medical advances over the last 15-20 years.